Without further ado, I give you Anne Louise Williams in An Evening with Poe.
The chateau into which my valet ventured to make forcible entrance, rather than permit me in my desperately wounded condition to pass the night in the open air, was one of those piles of commingled gloom and grandeur which have for so long frowned among the Apennines. To all appearances, it was temporarily and very lately abandoned. We established ourselves in one of the smallest and least sumptuously furnished apartments. It lay in a remote turret of the building. Its decorations were rich but tattered and antique. Its walls were hung with tapestries and bedecked with manifold and multiform armorial trophies, together with an unusually great number of very spirited modern paintings in frames of rich golden arabesque. In these paintings, which depended on the walls not only in their main surfaces, but in the many nooks which the bizarre architecture of the chateau rendered necessary. In these paintings, my incipient delirium perhaps caused me to take great interest, so that I bade Pedro close the shutters as it was already night, light the tongues of the tall candelabrum which stood at the head of my bed, and throw open far and wide the fringed curtains of black velvet which enveloped the bed itself. I wished all this done that I might resign myself, if not to sleep, then alternately to the contemplation of the paintings, and perusal of the small volume found upon the pillow which purported to criticize and describe them. Long, long I read, and devoutly I gazed. But the position of the candelabrum displeased me, and outreaching my hand with difficulty, rather than disturb my slumbering valet, I placed it so as to throw its rays more fully upon the book. But this act had an effect altogether unanticipated, for the rays of the numerous candles, and there were many, now fell upon a niche in the room which had hitherto been thrown into deep shadow by one of the bedposts. I thus saw in the vivid light a picture all unnoticed before. It was the portrait of a young girl just ripening into womanhood. I glanced hurriedly at the painting, then closed my eyes. My reason for doing this was at first not apparent even to my own perception. It was an instinctive movement to gain time for thought, to ensure that my vision had not deceived me, to calm and subdue my fancy for a more sober and more certain gaze. In a very few moments, I once again looked fixedly upon the portrait. That I now saw aright, I could not and would not doubt. The first flickering of the candles upon that canvas seemed to dissipate the dreamy stupor stealing over my senses, startling me at once into waking life. The portrait, as I have said, was that of a young girl. It was a mere head and shoulders done in what is technically termed a vignette manner, much in the style of the favourite heads of Sully. The arms, the bosom, even the ends of the radiant hair melted imperceptibly into the deep shadow that formed the background of the whole. The frame was oval, richly gilded and filigreed with moresque. As a thing of art, nothing could have been more admirable than the painting itself, but it could have been neither the excellence of the workmanship, nor the immortal beauty of the countenance which had so suddenly and so vehemently moved me. At the least, it could not have been that my fancy, shaken from its half-slumber, had mistaken the head for that of a living person. For I saw at once that the peculiarities of the design, of the vignetting, and of the frame must have instantly dispelled such an idea, must have prevented even its momentary entertainment. Thus engaged in thought, I remained for an hour perhaps, half sitting, half reclining, my vision riveted upon the portrait. At length, satisfied as to the true secret of its effect, I fell back within the bed. I had found the spell of the picture in its absolute life-likeness of appearance, which at first startling, had finally calmed, subdued, and appalled me. I replaced the candelabrum to its original position. The object of my deep agitation thus shut from view, I sought eagerly the volume which described the paintings and their histories. Turning to the number indicating the oval portrait, I read the vague and quaint words which follow. She was a maiden of the rarest beauty, and not more lovely than filled with glee. And evil was the hour when she met and loved and wedded the painter. He studious and austere, having already a bride in his art. She a maiden of the rarest beauty, not more lovely than filled with glee. all light and smiles and as frolicsome as a young fawn, loving and cherishing all things, hating only the art which was her rival, and despising only the palette, the brushes, and the other untoward instruments which deprived her of the countenance of her lover. And so it was a terrible thing for this lady to hear the painter speak of his desire to portray even his young bride. But she, humble and obedient, sat meekly for many weeks in a dark, high turreted chamber, with a light dripping on the pale canvas only from overhead. And he, the painter, gloried in his work, which went on from hour to hour and day to day, and he was a passionate and wild and moody man, and he would become lost in reverie. And so he would not see that the light that fell so ghastly in that dim chamber withered the health and spirits of his bride. But she smiled on and still on, for she could see that the painter who had high renown had a burning and fervid pleasure in his art, and worked night and day to depict her who so loved him, though she grew daily more dispirited and weak. And forsooth, some who beheld the portrait spoke of its resemblance in low words as of a mighty marvel, and proof not the less of the power of the painter, but more of the love he had for her whom he depicted so surpassingly well. But at length, as the work drew near its completion, there were none admitted to the turret, for the painter had grown wild with ardor for his work and turned his eyes rarely from the canvas to behold the countenance of his wife. And so he would not see that the tints he spread upon the canvas were drawn from the cheeks of her who sate beside him. And when many weeks had passed and there remained little to do, but a brush upon the cheek and a tint upon the eye, the spirit of the lady once again flickered up as the flame in the socket of the lamp. And then the brush was given, and the tint was placed. And for one moment the painter stood entranced before the work which he had wrought, but in the next, while yet he gazed, he grew tremulous and very pallid and aghast, and crying out loudly, "This is life itself!" turned to regard his beloved. She was dead. That is the oval portrait written by Edgar Allan Poe in 1842. Once upon a midnight dreary, as I pondered weak and weary, o'er many quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as if someone gently rapping at my chamber door. 'Tis some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. Only this and nothing more. Ah, distinctly I remember it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, for rare and radiant maiden whom the angels named Lenore, nameless here forevermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terror never felt before, so that now to still the beating of my heart I stood repeating, "'Tis some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. Some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This it is and nothing more." Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," said I, "oh madam, truly your forgiveness I implore. But the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping. So faintly you came tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you." Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there, wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token. And the only word there spoken was the whispered word, "Lenore?" This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, "Lenore." Merely this and nothing more. Back into my chamber, turning all my soul within me burning. Soon again I heard a tapping, something louder than before. Surely, said I, surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind and nothing more. Open here I flung the shutters, when with many a flirt and flutter, and there stepped a stately raven from the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped nor stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady perched above my chamber door. Perched upon the pallid bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door. Perched and sat, and nothing more. Then this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore. Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, surely, I said, thou art no craven, ghastly, grim, and ancient raven, wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Much I marvelled this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore, for we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door, with such a name as nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely on that placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing further than he uttered, not a feather than he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before, on the morrow he will leave me as my hopes have flown before. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Startled by the stillness broken, by reply so aptly spoken, doubtless, said I, what it utters is its only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master, whom unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster, till his songs that burden bore, till the dirges of his hopes that melancholy burden bore of never, never more. But the raven, still beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of bird and bust and door, and upon the velvet sinking I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim and gamely ghastly gaunt, an ominous bird of yore meant in croaking nevermore. This I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining on the cushion's velvet lining, with the lamplight glowing o'er. But on whose velvet violet lining, with the lamplight glowing o'er, she shall press, ah, nevermore. Then methought the air grew denser, perfumed by an unseen censer, swung by a seraphim whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath lent thee. By these angels he hath sent thee respite, respite in the nepenthe from thy memories of Lenore. Quaff this kind nepenthe, and forget this lost Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet, still of bird or devil, whether tempter sent or tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate yet all undaunted in this desert land, enchanted in this home by horror haunted, tell me, I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet, still of bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell the soul with sorrow laden, if within the distant Aden it shall clasp a sainted maiden whom the angels name Lenore, clasp a rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Be that word our sign of parting, bird or fiend, I shrieked upstarting. Get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul has spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, nevermore. And the raven never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door. And its eyes have all the seeming of a devil that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow across the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted, nevermore. That is The Raven, written by Edgar Allan Poe in 1845. True. Nervous. Very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am. But why do you think me mad? The disease had heightened my senses, not destroyed them, not dulled them. Above all, the sense of hearing was acute. I heard everything in heaven and on earth. I heard many things in hell, too. How then am I mad? But hark, listen how calmly, how healthily I will tell you the whole story. It is impossible to say when the idea first entered my brain, but once conceived it haunted me day and night. Object there was none. Passion there was none. I loved the old man. He'd never wronged me. He'd never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, that was it. One of his eyes was like that of a vulture, pale blue with a thin film over it, and whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold, and so by degrees, gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man and thereby rid myself of the eye forever. Now this is the point. You fancy me mad. Bad men know nothing. You should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went about my work. I was never kinder to the old man than the week before I killed him, and every night at about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it, oh, so gently. I opened it just sufficient to put my head in, and then I put in a dark lantern, closed tightly so that no light shone. And then I thrust in my head. Oh, it would have made you laugh to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I thrust it in slowly, very slowly, so as not to disturb the old man's sleep. It took an hour for me to get my whole head into the room. But a madman have been so clever. And then when I'd gotten my head into the room, I undid the lantern cautiously, because the hinges creaked. I undid it so that a single ray of light fell upon the vulture eye. I did this every night at about midnight. And every night the eye was closed. And so you see I could not complete my work, for it was not the old man that vexed me. It was his evil eye. And in the morning, when day broke, I boldly entered his chamber, courageously greeting him, calling him by name in a hearty tone, and asking how he'd passed the night. And so, you see, it would have been a ponderously wise old man to have suspected that every night at midnight I looked upon him as he slept. On the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. A watch's minute hand moved more quickly than did mine. Never before that night had I felt the extent of my own power, of my sagacity. I could scarcely contain my feeling of triumph, for to think there I was, opening the door little by little, and he not even to have dreamed of my secret deeds and thoughts. I fairly laughed at the idea, and perhaps I did, because he turned suddenly in the bed as if startled. Now you may think I drew back, but no. No, his room was black as pitch, with thick darkness, the shutters fastened close through fear of robbers, and I knew he would not see the opening of the door, and so I kept on, steadily. I had my head in the room and was about to open the lantern when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening. The old man sprang up in bed, crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quite still and said nothing. For an hour I did not move a muscle, and in the meantime I did not hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in bed, listening, as I have done, night after night, hearkening to the death watches in the wall. Presently I heard a low groan. I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not the groan of pain or of grief, oh no. It was the low stifled sound that rises from the bottom of the soul when it is overcharged with awe. I knew it well. Many a night at midnight, when the whole world slept, I felt it welling up within my own bosom, deepening with its dreadful echo the terror that distracted me. I say I knew it well. I knew what the old man felt, and I pitied him, though I chuckled in my heart, for I knew he'd been lying awake since the first slight noise when he turned in his bed, his fears ever since growing upon him. He'd been trying to fancy them causeless, but could not. He'd been saying to himself, "It is only the wind in the chimney, or a mouse running across the floor, or merely a cricket making a single chirp." He'd been trying to comfort himself with these suppositions, but it was all in vain, because death, in approaching, had stalked with its shadow before him, enveloping its victim. It was the mournful influence of this unperceived shadow that caused him to feel, though he neither saw nor heard, caused him to feel the presence of my head in the room. When I had waited a long time, very patiently, without hearing him lie down, I decided to open a very, very little crevice in the lantern, and so I did. You cannot imagine how stealthily, until at length a single ray shot out of the crevice and fell upon the vulture eye. It was open, wide open, and I grew furious, gazing upon it. I saw with perfect distinctness all a dull blue with a hideous veil over it, which chilled the very marrow of my bones. But I could see nothing else of the old man's face or person, because I had directed the ray, as if by instinct, precisely on the damned spot. Now I have told you, have I not, that what you mistake for madness is but over-acuteness of the senses. And now I say there came to my hearing a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well, too. It was the beating of the old man's heart, and it increased my fury as the beating of a drum stimulates a soldier to courage. And yet I refrained. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried how steadily I could maintain the ray upon the eye, and yet the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and quicker, louder and louder. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder, I say, louder every moment. Do mark me well. I have told you I am nervous, and so I am. And in the dead hour of the night, in the dreadful silence of that old house, so strange a noise as this excited me to uncontrollable terror, and yet I refrained. It grew louder and louder until I thought the heart must burst. And then I was seized upon by a new anxiety. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern and leaped into the room. He shrieked once, only once. In an instant, I dragged him to the floor, pulling the heavy bed over him. For several minutes, the heart beat on with a muffled sound. This, however, did not vex me, as I knew it could not be heard through the wall. At length, it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. He was stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there for several minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no more. Now, if you still think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for concealment of the body. The night waned and I worked hastily but in silence. First, I dismembered the corpse, cutting off the head, the arms, and the legs. I then took up 3 plankings from the flooring of the chamber and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the boards so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, would have detected anything suspicious. There was nothing to wash out. No stain of any kind, no blood spot whatever. And I'd been too wary for that. A tub had caught it all. When I made an end of these labors, it was 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. As the bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking on the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart, for what had I to fear? There entered 3 gentlemen who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbor during the night. Suspicion of foul play had been aroused. Information had been lodged at the police office, and they, the officers, had been deputed to search the premises. I smiled, for what had I to fear? I bade the gentlemen welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man I mentioned was absent in the country. I took the visitors all over the house. I bade them search well. At length, I led them to his chambers. I showed them his treasures, secure and undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room, desiring them to rest here from their fatigue, while I myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things. But ere long I felt myself getting pale and desired them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears. I talked more, freely to rid myself of the feeling, but it continued and gained definitiveness until at length I found the ringing was not within my ears. No doubt I now grew very pale. I talked more fluently and in a heightened voice, and yet the noise continually increased. And oh God, what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, and yet the noise steadily increased. I rose and argued over trifles in a high key with violent gesticulations, and yet the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro in a heavy stride as if excited to fury by the observation of the men, and yet the noise steadily increased. I foamed, I raved, I swore, I swung the chair upon which I'd been sitting and grated it on the boards. The noise rose over all and continually increased, and yet the gentlemen chatted pleasantly and smiled. Is it possible they heard it not? Almighty God, no. They heard. They suspected. They knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think. Anything was better than this agony. Anything more tolerable than this derision. At length, I could take those hypocritical smiles no longer. Villains, I shrieked! Dissemble no more! Tear up the planks! Here! Here! It is the beating of his hideous heart. That was The Telltale Heart, written by Edgar Allan Poe in 1842. For the most wild yet most homely narrative which I am about to pen, I neither expect nor solicit belief. Mad indeed would I be to expect it in a case where my very senses reject their own evidence. Yet mad am I not, and most surely do I not dream. For tomorrow I die, and today I would unburthen my soul. My immediate purpose is to place before the world plainly, succinctly, and without comment, a series of mere household events, the consequences of which have terrified, have tortured, have destroyed me. I will not attempt to expound them. To me they have proven little but horror. To many they will seem less terrible than morose. Perhaps hereafter some intellect may be found which can reduce my phantasms to commonplace, some intellect more calm, more logical, and far less excitable than my own, which will perceive in the circumstances I detail with awe nothing more than the ordinary succession of very natural causes and effects. From infancy I was noted for the docility and humanity of my disposition. My tenderness of heart was even of such consequence as to make me the jest of my companions. I was especially fond of animals and was indulged by my parents with a great variety of pets. With these I spent most of my time, and I was never so happy as when feeding and caressing them. This peculiarity of nature grew with my growth, and in manhood I derived from it one of my principal sources of pleasure. I married early and was happy to find in my wife a disposition not uncongenial with my own. Observing my partiality for domestic pets, she lost no time in procuring those of the most agreeable kind. We had birds, goldfish, a fine dog, rabbits, a small monkey, and a cat. The latter was a remarkably large and beautiful animal, entirely black, with a sagacious intelligence. Pluto, this was the cat's name, was my favorite pet and playmate. I alone fed him, and he attended me wherever I went about the house. It was even with difficulty that I could prevent him from following me through the streets. Our friendship lasted in this manner for several years, during which, through the fiend intemperance, my general temperament and character suffered a radical alteration for the worse. I grew day by day more moody, more irritable, more regardless of the feelings of others. I suffered myself to use intemperate language to my wife, and at length I offered her personal violence. My pets, too, were made to feel the change in my disposition. I not only neglected, but ill-used them. For Pluto, however, I retained sufficient regard to refrain from maltreating him, as I made no scruple of maltreating the rabbits, the monkey, and even the dog, if by accident or through affection they got in my way. But as my disease grew upon me, and what disease is there like alcohol? Even Pluto, who was growing old and somewhat peevish, even Pluto began to feel the effects of my ill temper. One night, returning home much intoxicated from one of my haunts about town, I fancied the cat avoided my presence. I seized it when frightened by my violence and inflicted a slight wound on my hand with its teeth. The fury of the demon instantly possessed me. I knew myself no longer. My original soul took flight from my body. I took from my waistcoat a penknife, opened it, and grasping the creature by the throat, I cut one of its eyes from the socket. I blush, I burn. I shudder in penning the damnable atrocity. When reason returned in the morning, when I slept off the fumes of the night's debauch, I experienced a sentiment half of horror and half of remorse for the crime of which I was guilty. But the feeling was at best feeble and equivocal, and left the soul untouched. I once again plunged into excess, and had soon drowned in wine all memory of the deed. In the meantime, the cat slowly recovered. The socket of the lost eye, it's true, presented a frightful appearance, but it no longer appeared to suffer any pain. It went about the house as usual, but as might be expected, fled in extreme terror at my approach. At first I had enough of my old tenderness of heart to be grieved by the evident dislike of a creature who had once so loved me. But this feeling soon gave way to annoyance, and then to my final and irrevocable overthrow of the spirit of perverseness. One morning in cool blood, I slipped a noose about the neck of the animal and hung it from the limb of a tree. I hung it with tears streaming from my eyes and with the bitterest remorse in my heart. I hung it because I knew it had once loved me, and because it had given me no reason for offense. I hung it because I knew in so doing I committed a sin, a deadly sin that would so jeopardize my immortal soul as to place it, if possible, beyond the mercy of the most merciful and most terrible God. On the night of the day of that cruel deed, I was awoken by the cry of fire. The curtains of my bed were in flames. The whole house was ablaze, and it was with great difficulty that my wife, a servant, and myself managed to escape the conflagration. The destruction was complete. My entire worldly wealth was swallowed up. I thenceforth resigned myself to despair. I am above the weakness of seeking to establish a sequence of cause and effect between the disaster and the atrocity, but I am detailing a chain of facts and wish not to leave a possible link imperfect. On the day succeeding the fire, I visited the ruins. The walls, with one exception, had fallen in. The exception was a compartment wall, not very thick, which stood about the middle of the house, and against which the head of my bed had rested. The plaster had here, to a great measure, resisted the flames, a fact that I attributed to it having been recently spread. About the wall, a dense crowd had collected, and many persons were examining a portion of it with minute and eager attention. The words strange, singular, and other similar expressions excited my curiosity. I approached and saw, as if graven in vast relief upon the white surface, the figure of a gigantic cat. The image was given in remarkably accurate detail. There was a rope about the animal's neck. When I first beheld this apparition, my wonder and horror were extreme. But upon reflection, reason came to my aid. The cat had been hung in a garden adjacent to the house. At the cry of fire, this garden had filled with a crowd, some one of whom had cut the animal from the limb of the tree and thrown it through the window. This had been done, no doubt, with a view as to rousing me from my sleep. The falling of the other walls had compressed the victim of my cruelty into the freshly laid plaster, the lime of which, together with the heat from the flames and the ammonia from the carcass, had accomplished the portraiture as I now saw it. For many months I could not rid myself of the phantasm of the cat. During this period there came into my spirit a sentiment which seemed but was not remorse. I went so far as to regret the loss of the animal, and began to look about me in the vile haunts that I now habitually frequented, for another pet of the same species and similar appearance, with which to take its place. One night, as I sat half stupefied in a den of more than infamy, my attention was suddenly drawn to some black object reposing on the head of an immense hogshead of gin or rum, which constituted the chief furniture of the apartment. I had been looking steadily at the top of this hogshead for some minutes, and was surprised that I had not before perceived the object thereupon. I approached and touched it with my hand. It was a black cat, a very large one, fully as large as Pluto, and resembling him in all respects except one. Pluto had not a single white hair on any portion of his body, but this cat had a very large but indefinite white splotch covering nearly the entire region of its breast. Upon my touching it, it arose, purred loudly, rubbed against my hand, and appeared delighted by my notice. This, then, was the creature for which I had been searching. I at once offered to purchase it from the landlord, but this person made no claim to it, knew nothing of it, had never seen it before. I continued my caresses, and when I prepared to leave, the creature evinced a desire to accompany me. I permitted it to do so, stooping and petting it as I went. When we reached the house, it domesticated itself at once, and became immediately a great favorite with my wife. For my own part, I felt an aversion to this creature rising within me. This is just the reverse of what I had anticipated. I know not how or why, but its evident fondness for myself rather disgusted and annoyed. By degrees, these feelings of disgust and annoyance rose to the bitterness of hatred. I avoided the creature, and a certain sense of shame for the crime of which I was guilty prevented me from physically abusing it. I came to look upon it with unutterable loathing, and to flee silently from its odious presence, as from the breath of a pestilence. What added no doubt to my hatred of the beast was the discovery on the morning after I brought it home, that, like Pluto, it too had been deprived of one of its eyes. But with my aversion to this creature, its evident partiality for myself increased. It followed in my footsteps with a pertinacity it would be difficult for the reader to comprehend. Whenever I sat, it crouched beneath my chair, or springing upon my knees, covered me with its loathsome caresses. If I stood to walk, it got between my feet and thus nearly threw me down, or fastening its long and sharp claws in my dress, clambered in this manner to my breast. Although at such times I longed to destroy it with a blow, I was withheld from doing so, partly by the memory of my former crime, but chiefly, let me confess at once, by my absolute dread of the beast. This dread was not exactly the dread of physical evil, although it would otherwise be hard to define. The terror and horror which this creature inspired within me were heightened by one of the merest chimeras of which it is possible to conceive. My wife had called my attention on more than one occasion to the character of the mark of white hair of which I have spoken, and which constituted the sole visible difference between this strange creature and the one I had destroyed. The reader will recall that the mark, although large, was originally indefinite. But by degrees nearly imperceptible, it had attained a rigorous distinctness of outline. It was now the representation of an object I shudder to name. It was now, I say, the image of a hideous, a ghastly thing, the gallows. And now was I wretched beyond the wretchedness of mere humanity, that a brute beast whose fellow I had so contemptuously destroyed, a brute beast who had worked out for me so much insufferable woe. Alas, neither by day nor by night knew I the blessing of rest any more. During the former, the creature left me no moment alone, and in the latter I started hourly from dreams of unutterable fear to find the hot breath of the thing upon my face, and its vast weight a nightmare incarnate, incumbent eternally upon my breast. Beneath the pressure of torments such as these, the feeble remnant of the good within me succumbed. Evil thoughts became my sole inmates, the darkest and most evil of thoughts. The moodiness of my usual temper rose to the hatred of all things and all mankind, while from sudden and frequent outbursts of fury to which I blindly abandoned myself, my uncomplaining wife was the most usual and most patient of sufferers. One day she accompanied me on some household errand into the cellar of the old building our poverty compelled us to inhabit. The cat followed me on the steep steps, nearly pitching me headlong, exasperated to madness and forgetting in my wrath the childish dread which hitherto stayed my hand. I uplifted an axe and aimed a blow at the creature, which of course would have proven instantly fatal if it had descended as I wished. But the blow was arrested by the hand of my wife. Goaded by the interference to rage more than demoniacal, I withdrew my arm from her grasp and buried the axe in her brain. She fell dead upon the spot without a moan. This hideous murder accomplished, I set myself forthwith and with entire deliberation to the task of concealing the body. I knew I could not remove it from the house either by day or by night without the risk of being observed by the neighbors. During this period, many projects entered my mind. At one, I thought of cutting the body into minute pieces and thus destroying it by fire. At another, I thought of digging a grave for it in the floor of the cellar. Deliberating further, I thought of casting it in a well in the yard, or packaging it as if merchandise, and so with the usual arrangements, getting a porter to take it from the house. At length, I hit upon an idea which I considered a far better expedient than either of these. I would wall it up in the cellar, as the monks in the Middle Ages are recorded to have walled up their victims. For such a purpose as this, the cellar was well adapted. The walls were loosely constructed and had been lately plastered over with a rough plaster which the damp atmosphere prevented from hardening. Moreover, in one wall there was a projection caused by a false chimney or fireplace which had been filled in and made to look like the rest of the cellar. I made no doubt that I could easily displace the bricks at this point, insert the corpse and wall the whole up as before, so that no eye would have detected anything suspicious. In my calculations I was not deceived. By means of a crowbar, I readily dislodged the bricks, and having inserted the corpse, I propped it in that position while with very little difficulty I relaid the entire structure as it originally stood. Having procured mortar, sand, and hair with all possible precaution, I prepared a plaster which could not be distinguished from the original, and with this very carefully went over the new brickwork. When I was finished, I was well satisfied with the results. The wall gave no appearance of having been disturbed. My next task was to find the beast that had been the cause of so much hideousness. I at length resolved to put it to death. If I could have met with it at that moment, there would have been no doubt as to its fate. But it appeared the crafty animal had been alarmed by the violence of my previous anger and forbore to present itself in my present mood. Nor did it make its appearance that night. The second and third day passed, and my tormentor came not. Once again I breathed a free man. The monster in terror had fled the premises forever. I should behold it no more. My happiness was supreme. The guilt of my dark deed bothered me but little. Some few inquiries had been made, but of course these had been readily answered. Even a search had been instituted, but of course nothing had been discovered. I looked upon my future felicity as secure. On the 4th day of the assassination, a party of the police came unexpectedly into the house and once again began a rigorous investigation of the premises. Secure, however, in the inscrutability of my place of concealment, I experienced no embarrassment whatsoever. They bade me accompany them on their search. They left no nook or cranny unexplored. At length, for the 3rd or 4th time, they descended into the cellar. I quivered not a muscle. My heart beat as calmly as one who slumbers in innocence. I walked the floor from end to end. I folded my arms across my bosom, easily roaming to and fro. At length, the officers were satisfied and prepared to leave. I burned to say one word, by way of triumph, and render doubly sure their assurance of my guiltlessness. Gentlemen, I said at length, as the party ascended the steps, I delight to have laid your suspicions. I wish you all health and a little more courtesy. By the by, gentlemen, this house is very well constructed. In my rabid desire to say something easily, I scarcely knew what I uttered at all. I mean to say this house is excellently well constructed. These walls, are you going, gentlemen? These walls are solidly put together. Here, in a mere frenzy of bravado, I rapped heavily with the cane I held in my hand upon that portion of the brickwork behind which stood the corpse of the wife of my bosom. May God shield and protect me from the fangs of the arch-fiend. No sooner had the reverberations of my blows sunken into silence when I was answered by a voice from within the tomb, a cry at first muffled and broken like the sobbing of a child, but quickly swelling into one long, loud, continuous scream, utterly anomalous and inhuman, a howl, a wailing shriek, half of horror and half of triumph, such as might have arisen only from the gates of hell, conjointly from the throats of the damned in their agony and the demons who exult in the damnation. Swooning, I staggered to the opposite wall. For a moment, the party on the steps remained motionless through the extremity of terror and awe. In the next, 12 stout arms toiled at the wall. It fell bodily. The corpse, already greatly decayed and clotted with gore, stood erect before the eyes of the spectators, and upon its head, with red mouth extended and solitary eye of fire, sat the hideous beast whose craft had seduced me to murder, and whose informing voice had consigned me to the hangman. I had rolled the creature up within the tomb. That, of course, is The Black Cat, written by Edgar Allan Poe in 1843. And I had the distinct honor of performing that in the house in Philadelphia where he wrote the story. So I would like to conclude with 2 short poems. The first was written in 1848 in honor of his wife, Virginia, even though it does not bear her name. Virginia had died slowly over 5 years from consumption, and it devastated Poe. And so he wrote this poem in her honor. It was many and many a year ago, in a kingdom by the sea, that a maiden there lived, whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And this maiden, she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. I was a child, and she was a child in this kingdom by the sea. But we loved with a love that was more than a love, I and my Annabel Lee, with a love that the winged seraphs of heaven coveted her and me. And that is the reason that long ago in this kingdom by the sea, a wind blew out of the clouds by night, chilling and killing my Annabel Lee, so that her high-born kinsman came and bore her away from me, to shut her up in a sepulchre in this kingdom by the sea. For the angels, not half so happy in heaven, went envying her and me. And that is the reason, as all men know in this kingdom by the sea, that a wind blew out of the clouds by night, chilling and killing my Annabel Lee. But our love, it was stronger by far than the love of those who were older than we, of those far wiser than we. And neither the angels in heaven above, nor the demons down under the sea, can ever dissever my soul from the soul of the beautiful Annabel Lee. For the moon never beams without bringing me dreams of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And the stars never rise, but I feel the bright eyes of the beautiful Annabelle Lee. And all the night tide I lie down by the side of my darling, my life and my bride, in her sepulchre there by the sea, in her tomb by the sounding sea. Take this kiss upon the brow, and in parting from you now, thus much let me avow. You are not wrong who deem that all my days have been a dream. And if hope has flown away in a night or in a day, a vision or a none, is it therefore the less gone? Is all that we see or seem but a dream within a dream? I stand amidst the roar of a surf-tormented shore, holding in my hand grains of the golden sand, so few, yet how they creep through my fingers to the deep, while I weep. Oh God, may I not grasp them with a tighter clasp? May I not save one from the pitiless wave? Is all that we see or seem but a dream within a dream? Thank you.
All right, thank you everyone for coming to our program. If you came in a little late, then that was Anne Louise Williams. She's a literary performer and historical interpreter, and this has been an Evening with Poe. I really hope you enjoyed it, and no matter what happens, even despite our circumstances, I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful Halloween. Thank you.